Our gospel for this morning comes from the Gospel according to John, the 21st chapter, and can be found on page 883 in the Pew Bibles. After he appeared to his followers in Jerusalem, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." They said to him, "We'll go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, Jesus said to him, "Follow me." The gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. All right. Well, fishing opener is next weekend. And I know, right? And in our gospel today, the disciples are fishing. Perfect timing, right? My son Marcus is a 9th grader, and he loves to fish. And a couple of weeks ago, he wanted to go fishing. And we had to break it to him that we were in between seasons. The ice had long ago melted, so he couldn't go ice fishing, and the fishing opener still too far in the future, so no fishing allowed. He was bummed. He was very bummed, and I know many of you feel his pain. Being in between can be tough. With fishing seasons, you gotta find something else to do for a few weeks. For other in-betweens in life, it can be a little trickier. Pastor Dan just announced that he's retiring at the end of July, and those of you who have already retired can probably tell him that being newly retired is gonna feel like an in-between time, right? There's an adjustment period people go through when they retire, especially if they're married, according to my parents. So I do remember, though, when I was a kid and my grandfather retired. He was a farmer, and when my grandparents moved in to town, moved off the farm, I remember that being really tough for my grandpa. He was still active, and he'd been a farmer his whole life. So if he wasn't a farmer, who was he now? What was he supposed to do? And so we kind of watched him struggle with that for a little bit, and I think he ended up deciding that he would always be a farmer, because he spent those first few years of retirement driving the 8 miles out to the farm almost every day to help my cousin, who was now farming the land. So I think Jesus' disciples could probably relate to that. After Jesus' death and resurrection, they weren't sure who they were anymore. Were they still disciples? Or should they go back to their day jobs? I mean, some of them were fishermen, so who could blame them for going back to that, right? And that's exactly where we find them in John 21. They're not sure what to do, so when Peter says he's going fishing, the rest of them say, we'll go with you. They fish all night and they get skunked. Don't catch a thing. And then Jesus shows up. This is after the resurrection, so it takes a minute for them to figure out it's him. And now they catch a ton of fish, and Jesus cooks them up for breakfast. After they all have breakfast, Jesus takes Peter aside. Now, I'm pretty sure Jesus knew that going fishing was Peter's idea. He knew Peter was struggling with living in this in-between moment, trying to figure out who he was and what he was supposed to do now in this post-Easter reality. So Jesus talks to him. He tells Peter, feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep, follow me. There's a whole lot going on in this conversation, but this is the heart of it. Peter is still a disciple. He's still supposed to follow Jesus. The job's a little different now because Jesus is preparing to leave, so he needs Peter to become like a shepherd to the rest of the disciples. That's Peter's future, to feed and tend the flock. Now keep in mind that 10 chapters earlier, Jesus said that he's the good shepherd. So when Jesus cooks breakfast on the shore and tells Peter, I need you to be the shepherd now, what do you think went through Peter's head? I bet he was freaking out. That's a big job. Is Jesus asking him to fill his shoes? Peter probably thought, man, I can't do that. Because let me tell you something about Peter. You know the story of Peter denying Jesus 3 times on the night Jesus was betrayed? Well, in John's gospel, Peter's denial isn't about who Jesus is. In John, Peter denies who he is. He's asked, are you one of his disciples? Peter answers, I am not. Again, aren't you one of his disciples? No, I am not. And a third time, are you sure you're not one of his disciples? I am not. For whatever reason, Peter wasn't ready or able to claim his own identity that night. We don't know if it was fear or what, but he wasn't able to say, yes, I'm a follower of Jesus. Yes, I'm one of his disciples. So now, after Jesus' death and resurrection, when Jesus shows up and tells him what kind of disciple he needs him to be now, a shepherd, I bet Peter freaked out. I bet he thought back to that night when he denied being a disciple. I bet he thought, I'm not worthy to do this job. Why would Jesus want me, of all people, to feed his lambs and tend his sheep, to look after other followers? I am not the right person for this job. What Peter may not realize at first is that what he said or did before doesn't matter. As Professor Caroline Lewis says, Jesus shows up on that shore, hosts a meal one more time, and tells Peter, I believe in you. I know who you are, and I love you. And yes, you are exactly the disciple I need, the disciple the world needs to bring God's love to the world. We know from the New Testament that Peter lived into that identity. He knew where he'd been, the mistakes he'd made over the years, the lessons he learned while traveling with Jesus. He found himself in an in-between time after the resurrection, fishing, wondering what to do next. And in that moment, Jesus shows up and reminds him that the answer about what to do is rooted in his identity, in who Peter is, a disciple whose job is to bring God's love to the world by tending the sheep. And you know what? This happens to us too. When we find ourselves in an in-between time, Jesus shows up to remind us who we are, to tell us clearly that it doesn't matter where we've been, what mistakes we've made, what our past looks like. All of those things, good or bad, have brought us to that in-between moment. If you are in an in-between moment right now, Jesus wants to say, I believe in you. I know who you are, and I love you. And yes, you are exactly the disciple I need, the disciple the world needs to bring God's love to the world. Because that's true for all of us. Claim your identity as a child of God, as a follower of Jesus, as a disciple, one who learns from Jesus, and bring God's love to the world. That's the call for all of us, to spread God's love in the world, to make John 3:16 real in people's lives. The world needs that right now, don't you think? There's enough hate, enough violence. We get to spread God's love. And if you think you're not the right person to do that, remember Peter. He didn't think he was the right person either. But Jesus knew he was exactly the right person. And so are you. There's a Christian recording artist named Lauren Daigle, and her song You Say is playing on all the pop radio stations right now. And it's a song she wrote after her first Dove Awards show. She wrote it to keep herself grounded, to remind herself through all the ups and downs of who God says she is, and how that identity can remind her how to live in the present. So here's a clip of Lauren Daigle talking about writing that song.
So when writing You Say, I just remember feeling for the first time through this book, it was definitely the first moment in just being an artist about, okay, where is all this going exactly? And I know we've all faced moments in life where we can feel a crossroads at, and we can see the past and also see the future and realize how we are supposed to exist in the present. And it was one of those moments where I could see where things were going, and I knew exactly where I came from, and I knew that the world is still married. And thus brought us the issue of identity, and trying to figure out how to exist in our field in different directions.
We can relate, can't we? Living between the past and the future, feeling pulled in different directions. If we remember who we are, whose we are, and if we believe Jesus when he says, you are exactly the person I need to bring God's love to the world, then we know how to live today. The past brought you to where you are, whatever in between that may be. Jesus shows up and says, you are mine. Spread God's love in the world. That's what we're supposed to do. That's how we live in the present. And that will shape the future, our future and the world's. Amen.